Hello and welcome to today's Public Health Matters webinar, Understanding Novel Coronavirus. My name is David. I will be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. If you experience technical difficulty at any time during this WebEx event, please submit your technical issues in the Q&A panel and I will assist you. Please note that as an attendee, you're part of a larger audience today. However, due to privacy concerns, the attendee list is not displayed. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's call, and as a reminder, this call is being recorded. Time permitting, we will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the drop down as all panelists. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce your first speaker for today, Roman Blahowski with Ecolab. Roman, you now have the floor.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today you'll be hearing from our panel of experts pulled together to discuss and address questions about the current novel coronavirus outbreak. Our goals today are to share expertise about the coronavirus and public health concerns, provide guidance on how to keep employees and customers safe, and will include industry-specific insights and practical tips for those within the hospitality, restaurant, long-term care, food and beverage processing, and healthcare industries. We have several experts with us today. The first is Dr. Ruth Petran, Senior Corporate Scientist for Food Safety and Public Health at Ecolab. Dr. Petran provides technical expertise and consultation to internal and external customers on food safety and public health issues by identifying and tracking emerging food safety trends and new control technologies. Linda Homan is a board-certified infection prevention specialist with more than 20 years of experience. Linda is responsible for the development of clinical and educational solutions, applied clinical research, and incorporation of clinical best practices in all healthcare offerings. Dr. Tatiana Lorca is Ecolab's Food Safety and Quality Program Leader for the Global Food and Beverage Division. Dr. Lorca works regularly with customers operating food and beverage processing plants on issues related to food safety and audit compliance. And also joining us today is Ed Snodgrass. Ed is a chemical engineer with more than 15 years of experience in new product development within Ecolab's institutional segment and provides technical expertise and consultation to customers throughout North America and the world. So first up is Dr. Ruth Petran. Ruth, welcome, and we look forward to hearing the information you have to provide today.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you to you all online for joining us to hear about this very important topic. We really appreciate your being with us. Next slide, please. So to start off, I want to give you some background about coronavirus, representing what we're hearing from public health authorities. Early in the new year, Chinese public health authorities identified a novel coronavirus and have deemed it 2019-nCoV, acute respiratory disease. This was a new coronavirus that we had not seen before, but we know it's causing fever and various respiratory symptoms. And to date, tens of thousands of people have been infected with hundreds of reported deaths. The largest number of cases are in China, and others have been identified, though, in Asia, the US, and in Europe, primarily in people who had previously visited China. The link on this screen takes you to a global map of confirmed cases from Johns Hopkins, which is doing a great job at tracking these numbers. Because this situation is rapidly evolving and changing just about daily, Public health authorities, including those from the World Health Organization and local or national public health agencies, are actively investigating this outbreak, and the situation will continue to evolve. Next slide, please. What is a coronavirus? Well, the reality is that these are a large family of viruses that cause a wide-ranging bunch of illnesses, from common cold to much more severe diseases that you may have heard of in the past, such as Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, CoV, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS-CoV. This new one, this novel coronavirus, is a new strain that had not been previously identified in humans. We know that these are transmitted, or can be, between animals and people. And there are several coronaviruses circulating in animals that haven't affected people yet. The animal source of this particular strain that is infecting people, this novel coronavirus, has not yet been identified. Common signs of infection from coronavirus include primarily respiratory symptoms, but also sometimes fever, cough, shortness of breath, and so on. In the more severe yet much more rare cases, it can progress to pneumonia and more severe respiratory syndromes and can lead to death. But the reality is, with this novel coronavirus, it's estimated that more than 80% of the cases are relatively mild. Next slide, please. The spread of coronavirus does depend on the particular strain. Rarely, they can be spread through fecal-oral sorts of transmission routes, but much more commonly through respiratory droplets, such as how a common cold would be transmitted. So with that as its primary transmission method, it can spread from one infected person to another through the air, by coughing or sneezing, by close personal contact, such as touching or shaking hands, or touching an object or a surface that may have virus particles on them, and then touching your mouth, nose, or eyes before you wash your hands. We are seeing some evidence of person-to-person transmission from this novel coronavirus, and there is investigation ongoing of some of these case clusters. Primarily, it's demonstrating, though, that there has to be very, very close contact with an infected person for this person-to-person transmission to occur, such as a healthcare worker who is caring for an infected patient. Next slide, please. We need to recognize that there are steps all of us can take to help protect public health. And across the many industries that we serve, we believe that everybody can have an important role in helping to protect public health. Ecolab is here to help you and your businesses with standard infection control practices, training, and compliance. Next slide, please. So a couple slides here on just basic protection mechanisms. First of all, as we think about ourselves, there is no vaccine available to protect you against this new coronavirus because it's new. But there are ways you can reduce your risk of infection by following fairly standard infection control practices, like washing your hands very often and correctly. The World Health Organization recommends performing hand hygiene with soap and water, or using an alcohol-based hand rub if soap and water are not available. To avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. To avoid close contact with people who are sick, and regions where live animals are being sold or raised, where there are excessive cases being reported. If it's warranted, wearing a mask and seeking medical advice immediately if you have a fever or other symptoms after traveling, and make sure to tell the doctor where you have traveled to. Next slide, please. But we also need to protect others. So if you have cold-like symptoms, you can help protect others by following these kinds of practices. that are very much like protecting ourselves. Washing your hands, wearing a mask, staying home when you're sick, avoiding close contact with others, practicing sleeve and cough etiquette, such as using a tissue or sneezing or coughing into your flexed elbows and throwing the tissue, if you have used one, into the trash, and washing your hands. Seeing a doctor and cleaning and disinfecting surfaces and objects. Next slide, please. Now, leading into the next part of this webinar, I'd like to just briefly touch on a couple general sorts of questions we have received, which will get more specific from my colleagues here, and then we do have time at the end for even more specific questions as you have them. But thinking about what you need to do within your business for public health protection, firstly is making sure that your employee health and hygiene practices are in place, especially with an emphasis on proper hand hygiene. Disinfecting hard surface and high-touch areas, such as those listed on the slide. The good news is that coronavirus is in enveloped viruses, and these are less resistant to disinfectants, which means that they can be used very effectively to kill coronavirus, which might be on a surface. And then where appropriate, making sure the right personal protective equipment is available and people know how to use it. Next slide, please. Now, what about food safety? Well, of course, standard food safety practices are always encouraged, beginning with and avoiding direct unprotected contact with live animals and surfaces that may be in contact with those live animals. Certainly to avoid consuming raw or undercooked animals or sick animals or the meat from them. Avoiding cross-contamination by properly handling any raw kinds of products, and then properly cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, including your hands and any utensils. But it is very, very important to keep in mind that there is no evidence that the 2019 novel coronavirus is being transmitted to humans through food. Next slide, please. Finally, another question is, should you worry about shipments coming from China? The reality is that coronaviruses really don't survive very long on surfaces. So the risk of spread from products or a package is very low. And to date, there is no evidence that supports transmission of the 2019 novel coronavirus with any imported goods. At this point, I'm going to turn the slides over to my colleague, Linda Homan, to talk about application in healthcare.
Thank you, Ruth. Next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about action plan for healthcare. And this is really divided into three different areas, what we would do for patients, what we would do for our personnel, and what we would do for hygiene. And the first thing I would say is that the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention both have detailed plans for management of known or suspected patients with coronavirus. And so that's where really the very best information is that's available to you. And this is an overview of that, and I highly suggest that you would go to the World Health Organization.int or cdc.gov for more information. So first of all, for patients, we ask that the patients who are known or suspected wear a surgical mask. We have them evaluated in a private room with the door closed, and ideally that room would be an infection isolation room with reversed airflow. For healthcare personnel, we're asking healthcare personnel to use standard precautions, contact precautions, and airborne precautions. And that's just a measure of caution because we want to make sure that we completely understand how this virus is transmitted. And in addition to that, eye protection, which would be things such as goggles or a face shield. And then for hygiene for healthcare facilities, hand hygiene is incredibly important, as Ruth already said. The World Health Organization recommends performing hand hygiene with soap and water or alcohol-based hand rub if soap and water aren't available, but frequent hand hygiene incredibly important. And then disinfection of surfaces using an EPA-registered product that has a claim against emerging viral pathogens. And so that'll be what you'll look for on your product or information from your manufacturer is for a claim against emerging viral pathogens. And so with that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Ed Snodgrass, to talk to you about long-term care.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about long-term care, hospitality, and food service. Next slide, please. Thank you. So stopping the spread of infection in long-term care is a standard business practice today, especially where sensitive resident populations are concerned. Long-term care should follow local health recommendations and reinforce infection prevention training for employees, including personal hygiene, hand washing, coughing into a flex elbow, and providing personal protection equipment in accordance with infection prevention policies at your facility. Ample access to hand soap and alcohol-based hand sanitizers for employees and residents is also important. Some residents may need reminders on proper hand washing or the importance of using hand sanitizers. Clean and disinfect surfaces, including high touchpoint objects such as hand railings and elevator buttons more frequently. Resident rooms should be disinfected regularly in addition to public spaces. If there is a particular concern about the spread of illness, consider closing non-essential public areas and offering in-room dining. Next slide, please. Hospitality customers generally have a higher percentage of the customer base who have been traveling recently and who remain on the property for an extended period of time, such as overnight. And so hospitality customers are often highly concerned with infection prevention. For hospitality, we encourage properties to follow local public health recommendations and to follow their established infection prevention procedures. Here we call out a few that are common questions we receive around hospitality. Of course, ensure that your employees are practicing personal hygiene, washing hands frequently, and properly coughing into their elbow. Make sure hand soap and alcohol-based hand sanitizers are readily available throughout your property for employees and guests alike. Increase frequency of cleaning and surface disinfection, especially around high touchpoint objects such as elevator buttons, surfaces in the lobby, guest rooms, and fitness centers. Next slide, please. There is no evidence that coronavirus is spread through contaminated food, but basic food safety and infection prevention measures still apply. We always advise our customers follow local public health recommendations and provide training to their employees on infection prevention and personal hygiene, washing hands frequently with soap and water, and coughing into a flexed elbow. Make sure guests and customers and employees have access to hand soap and alcohol-based hand sanitizers, maybe by adding additional hand sanitizer stations throughout your establishment. Vulnerable spots in restaurants that may require additional attention are keeping soap dispensers filled in the restroom and the kitchen and making alcohol-based hand sanitizers available to the staff and guests. And disinfect high touch points, door handles, menus, tables, chairs, and other things in the front of the house. In the kitchen, continue to apply food safety practices, ensuring foods are well prepared, and of course, it continues to be important to sanitize food contact surfaces in accordance with local regulations, both front and back of house. And with that now, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tatiana Lorca to talk about global food and beverage.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to address what recommendations are for food and beverage processing plants, because that is a question I do get fairly often. So it really comes down to these 4 key steps. First, follow good manufacturing and food safety practices, and this includes practices from receiving, handling, and preparing any raw materials, ingredients, packaging materials, then utensils, work in progress, and finished products. So that should not change. Then, because this is more of a public health issue, we need to make sure that our employee health and hygiene practices are in place and that they're maintained, including proper hand washing, as our other speakers have mentioned. Now, let's talk about cleaning and sanitizing. So clean and sanitize food contact and non-food contact surfaces. So make sure those are done, as well as carrying out environmental cleaning and sanitation. So this means assuring that areas such as floors and walls, ceilings, and equipment are all fully cleaned and sanitized. And as you are cleaning and sanitizing, make sure that you're only using those sanitizers which are known to be suitable for their use, and that they're suitable for their use in a food manufacturing facility, and that you are following the label instructions, because that's extremely important. I do want to talk about one of the questions that I get fairly frequently about this, which is, what do I need to do differently to protect my people and my customers? And then what do I need to do as far as cleaning and sanitation? Do I need to clean and sanitize more frequently during this outbreak? And I'd just like to highlight what I just mentioned and reinforce this. And we all know that cleaning and sanitation are critical components of the good manufacturing practices that should already be carried out regularly in your facility. And we want to make sure that your production environment is clean and sanitary and that you are complying with the law. Now, whether to increase the frequency during this outbreak has to be looked at through a risk-benefit lens, and then many things have to be considered. Now, firstly, you need to ask yourself, is your facility located within the outbreak zone? Are your employees affected? How exposed is your product? And if so, increasing the frequency may reduce transmission, and it could be seen as a benefit. Now, we also know that every time you clean and sanitize equipment, following validated protocols and approved products, you do cause a little wear and tear on the equipment and the surfaces. So here's the risk. So what you need to consider is that you need to weigh the risk-benefit equation here, and you need to make a risk-based decision. And now I'll turn this back over to Dr. Petran. Ruth?
Thank you, Linda, Ed, and Tatiana, for terrific messages focusing in on the specific markets. Next slide, please. So just to briefly wrap it up here, and then we'll jump to questions. Ecolab is here to help, and I urge you, please, to connect with your team for world-class training programs and tools. Think about the application of webinars and use of these. We have a number of these available on our website. We certainly provide on-site technical support as well as call center support available 24/7. Next slide, please. Bottom line, together we can all make a difference. And I think we've talked through several different ways to do this. Really, it focuses on following basic infection control practices. And if I can re-emphasize the need for vigilant hand hygiene, I'm going to do that as many times as I can. On the other hand, we need to stay very alert to this because this is an evolving situation. So staying connected to developments about novel coronavirus is very crucial. Ecolab will do our best to share this information as it becomes available and as it may apply to all of you. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will turn this over to my colleague Roman, who will be monitoring questions. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you to other presenters as well. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I want to jump right into them. But before I do, please know that we will send a copy of the presentation to everyone who has joined the webinar today, so you will have access to that presentation to share with your teams. In addition, a recording of this webinar will also be posted to ecolab.com. So we'll have it on the website for those that want to, in addition to sharing the presentation, want to share the actual webinar recording as well with their teams. So Ruth and our other panelists, first question, how long can this virus live or survive on a surface?
Well, this is Ruth. I will start off. The short answer is we don't know. Keep in mind that this is a new virus, really not available for a lot of study, but the data that the World Health Organization is sharing with us is that it's not all that likely that transmission can occur from an infected surface. The risk is much lower from them than from a direct droplet, which you may get from an infected person. So certainly being vigilant around surfaces which could be contaminated with viral particles from one of these droplets is important. But at this point, it's not expected to be a significant route of transmission, but it is a possibility.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Ed, this might be a question for you, but do we know at this point if laundry or sheets, clothing, things like that you may see in a hotel, hospital, or long-term care facility, do we know if laundry is a concern for potential transmission of the illness?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad that came up. So I'd say three things on that. Number one, always follow your local health guidelines. That will be number one. Number two, excuse me, I would say that when it comes to laundry, it's about the whole linen flow process from the room down to the laundry operation to keeping the linen clean and stored. And make sure you're wearing your proper protective equipment, gloves and things like that when you're actually handling the laundry from people's rooms. If somebody appears to be infected in any way, make sure you bag that linen in their room and bring it downstairs appropriately. And then for the laundry process itself, what's recommended is to use just a standard detergent, which should be part of every laundry process, that can emulsify grease and oils. There is no additional need, like I said, follow your local health guidelines as well, but there should be no additional need for a registered sanitizer product as part of the laundry process. Just the process of actually cleaning the linen through the washing machine and then drying it should be enough to reduce any pathogen contamination and prevent cross-contamination. And then when the linen is complete and it's put on the shelf, make sure proper handling is observed, so don't touch the dirty linen, and then handle the clean linen with the same gloves or the same hands. So follow the standard procedures that are being followed today, and you should be okay.
Thanks, Ed. Tatiana, this might be one for you. Do we know if food-grade sanitizers are effective against this new coronavirus?
That's a great question. And here I ultimately, I'm going to defer back to Ruth to see if she's got a little bit of information on this. Ruth?
Sure. Bottom line, because again, this is a new virus that really no one has access to do research against to any significant degree, and certainly not companies like this because it's new. What the allowance has been from the regulatory agencies, at least in the U.S., is that disinfectants that have demonstrated effectiveness against viruses that are like the 2019 novel coronavirus, when used in accordance with the directions, can be used. So essentially, it's use of a disinfectant that has a claim against a supporting virus or one that would be like novel coronavirus is deemed to be effective.
Great, thank you, Ruth.
So depending on what the risk might be believed to be present, using a disinfectant might be warranted, but it does need to be considered within the landscape of the whole risk that's presented.
Another question coming in. Will soap and water, from a hand perspective, work to help protect against the virus, or do you also need perhaps a hand sanitizer in addition to soap and water?
This
Linda,
is Linda. Do you want me to answer? Sure.
Yeah.
I would say that the World Health Organization and the CDC both say that you can use either alcohol-based hand sanitizer or soap and water. So there aren't any recommendations that I've seen so far that you need to do both. The physical and mechanical action of washing your hands and rinsing them with water helps reduce the bacteria and the viruses on your hands. And so I think there isn't any recommendation that you have to do both. You just have to do one or the other. If your hands are visibly soiled, then you should use soap and water. If your hands aren't visibly soiled, then you have the option to use alcohol-based hand sanitizer.
I do think it's important to note as well, thank you, Linda, that generally soap and water are recommended first, and alcohol hand sanitizer in situations where soap and water may not be readily available, then alcohol-based hand sanitizer would be a reasonable substitute for that. But with the caveat related to visibly soiled hands, do need soap, soap and water to get that soap, or to get that dirt removed.
Great. Here's a two-part question, and we may have insight into one part, maybe not the other, but I will ask the question. If you're looking at a hotel, would a hotel need to be worried about coronavirus transmission through air ducts within the hotel as well as higher population common areas?
So, Ruth, I can talk just a moment to the HVAC system in general. So, because that question did come up recently, it's a great question. And apparently, transmission of this type of a virus is typically done, or we're seeing it by closer contact. So the risk of getting this disease transmitted via the HVAC system to you is very, very low. So our recommendation would be that no additional things need to be done for an HVAC system to prevent it. Now, in terms of the open spaces, Ruth, I would rely on you for that question.
Yeah, and I certainly support what Ed said. In fact, the World Health Organization is clear on this as well. We don't have evidence of transmission through HVAC systems, but it's something that is continually being assessed. And part of this evolving nature of this virus and its study, and trust me, there's lots and lots of public health scientists in many countries looking at questions just like this. But there's not evidence to date of that. Through more public sorts of spaces, again, think about droplet transmission. So typically these are not over long distances, but within a couple of feet of someone who is, again, actively sneezing, coughing, spreading infectious materials around through their droplets. That's the kind of area to be thinking about. But if everybody is following the practices on keeping themselves away from others when they are actively sick, practicing effective cough and sneeze etiquette and so on, that in combination with these other practices certainly reduces the risk tremendously.
Ruth, a follow-up question on that. Do we know if the virus requires moisture to survive transmission? You're talking about droplets, sneezes. Do we know if it requires moisture versus dry surface or material?
I would say we don't know that definitively, and this is something that study, further study that lots and lots of folks are doing is focused in on, among other things. Certainly transmission through a droplet, which is intuitively just more moist than not, might lead us to think that, but we don't have a definitive answer on that.
Okay. Linda, I believe this is a question for you. Is there any special treatment or recommendation that should be applied to cleaning a room or disinfecting a room if a potential sick guest was within that room?
That's a good question, and I think I would refer back to the World Health Organization and the CDC, but my understanding is that if you're using a disinfectant that's effective against the novel coronavirus and you've ensured that, then your cleaning should really just be standard cleaning. You try to use dedicated equipment wherever you can, according to the CDC. In other words, equipment that you're going to not use on another patient but discard. If you can't use dedicated equipment, then you would want to disinfect any equipment according to the manufacturer's instructions, using a disinfectant that's effective against the novel coronavirus. And really, those are that's the gist of the environmental hygiene recommendations that they have for healthcare situations. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good summary of what's being asked. I would also say, in addition to making sure you're using the right disinfectant, the CDC is also recommending that you might want to do a little refresher training with your staff and to monitor how well they're cleaning and disinfecting surfaces. And monitor the thoroughness of cleaning of high-touch objects in healthcare settings, just to make sure that your staff is sharpened up and doing the best job possible. So it's product plus process. You have to make sure you not only use the right product, but that you're using it correctly and applying it to the right surfaces.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Another question coming in here. Are people at risk for coronavirus from perhaps a package or a product shipped from China?
Yeah, we had a slide that addressed this, but I'm happy to go back to that. And the WHO is very clear on this, that is not presenting a risk, partly because of the time that such a shipment would just realistically take. But there is not evidence of transmission through anything like that.
And then Ruth, a follow-up on that. So, maybe it's one thing if it's packaging, but what about perhaps fruits, vegetables, food shipped from China? Is there a greater concern there, or what are we seeing, or what might we know about that?
Yeah, from a coronavirus perspective, whether it's a package like a box or say a piece of fruit, there's really no distinction per se from a coronavirus transmission perspective. Typically, as we've said already, these viruses don't survive very long on surfaces really of any sort, so the spread from a product or a package is low. That said, we can't forget about all of the normal kinds of food safety practices that we need to follow. And if there could be an enhanced risk of transmission of a more typical foodborne illness kind of agent from some of these food products, then certainly standard food safety practices, which is not really the focus of this webinar, but proper temperature control and cooking and minimizing cross-contamination, hand hygiene as a part of foodborne illness risk management certainly can't be ignored and should not be put aside just because we're so focused in on coronavirus.
Thanks, Ruth. Another question here. Is there a virus similar to this particular coronavirus that people can look towards for perhaps on a food grade sanitizer label or product label showing that product may provide benefit against this particular coronavirus?
I can take that question. So we at Ecolab we do have emerging pathogen claims on a number of our products. These claims allow us to use certain viruses that are similar to the coronavirus to not claim necessarily, but we can recommend them in use against the coronavirus. So we do have a list of products. I would say if you have questions on what those organisms are or which products you can use, talk to your local Ecolab representative for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and coronavirus, it is a virus that we are concerned about here. So we do need to be looking for claims against a virus that would have or would require some activity against a virus. This is not a standard, salmonella kind of bacteria. It is a virus. That said, I do think we need to be very careful about framing this up within the reasonable risk that you believe is presented. And, in many, many parts of the world, the risk is so excruciatingly low that I urge you to keep that in mind.
Ruth, along those lines, we're seeing news stories every day. Some saying that the virus could be spread through the piping system within a building, and other ways that the virus could be spread. Do you have any guidance regarding, I guess, what we truly know about the virus at this point compared to what we may be seeing in the news?
That's a $1 million question. I think I can't refute and react to all kinds of news stories that are out there, and there certainly are lots and lots of them. In following very carefully much of the communications from the World Health Organization, what I find very interesting is that is a rather significant focus of the WHO's response is a so-called mythbuster kind of approach, and in really trying to provide the most accurate information that's out there. If someone wants to see this information, if I might urge you to Google World Health Organization or WHO and mythbuster in the same search string, and you will get information related to that. I have seen that information be added to over time, so they are continuing to work on adding more information to that. But the reality is, outside of China, the risk is considered very low, as long as these basic infection sorts of control practices are in place. And given that many of us here in the Northern Hemisphere are in the midst of influenza season, as we typically are this time of year, being more vigilant just in general about our health and about transmission of viral kinds of illnesses, and practicing those basic kinds of infection control practices around effective hand washing, staying home when we're sick, practicing sneeze and cough etiquette, and so on, do go so far in preventing overall kinds of respiratory illnesses. And that is in large part, many of the messages that are coming from the World Health Organization are focused in on continuing to emphasize the need to follow those basic kinds of practices. I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but that's the reality that we're hearing.
Thank you, Ruth. That is very helpful. I guess I'll open this question up to everyone. For employees within the hospitality industry, perhaps the healthcare industry as well, are there recommendations that these employees should be taking to help protect themselves while they are in their work environment?
And this is Linda, and I think Ruth had a slide on this earlier about how to protect ourselves, and I think it's really true in almost any setting, in that you're practicing good hand hygiene, you're practicing good respiratory hygiene, in other words, coughing into your sleeve, coughing into a tissue, and washing your hands after. You're staying home if you're sick so that you're not infecting others. Really just the same kinds of things that you would do during influenza season are the basic practices that we all need to follow to protect ourselves. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you're with a known or suspected patient or person who's infected with the virus, then the precautions change, and then the way that you're going to move around that environment change. But just in general, those same basic things that we do to prevent ourselves from catching a cold or from catching influenza are good practices to follow to prevent transmission of this coronavirus. Ruth, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Nope, that says it well.
Same on the food service and lodging side, exactly the same recommendation.
One more question here. Based on what we know about coronaviruses in general, would temperature play an impact in transmission, either if it is very cold temperatures like we have here in the far north of the United States this time of year, or perhaps more warmer locations? Does temperature play a role in transmission?
Typically not. If we take viral transmission in general, or respiratory viral transmission in general, the one thing that we might consider is that those of us who are living in colder climates tend to stay inside more so than if it were warmer outside more consistently. And just by virtue of that fact, we are, staying inside and staying potentially closer to people. So emphasis on these basic infection prevention practices, like really isolating yourself if you are suffering with symptoms of respiratory illness, and being vigilant in the other ways that we've talked about, may be even more important in these colder climates, just because of the reality of our being, put all together in a building, et cetera.
One more question here, perhaps, for the lodging industry, long-term care, and probably hospital facilities as well. We talked earlier about hard surfaces. Do we have a sense of the virus and the possibility of survival in, say, a mattress or bedding, beyond perhaps just the sheets that would probably be laundered on a regular basis?
I guess, Ruth, I'd look to you for this. I'm not.
We don't have any data on that, but I think we need to think about just general transmission of respiratory illnesses. Transmission through something like a mattress is not how they are transmitted. It's direct droplets from one infected person coming into another person. Someone sneezing in your face, to be that graphic. That is how they are transmitted most commonly, and there's just no evidence of that, kind of side route through a mattress impacting that.
One more question here. Do we know if, we probably might not know for this particular coronavirus, but coronaviruses in general, do we know about survivability on perhaps a cleaning cloth that is being used with the appropriate disinfectant?
This is Linda. I can just take a stab at it, but I think the main thing to realize is that these disinfectants have a contact time. And so if your virus comes in contact with that disinfectant for the recommended contact time, and the disinfectant is effective against the novel coronavirus, then it will be, it will not survive on that cloth in contact with that disinfectant for the recommended contact time. Anybody else on the call want to?
No, I think from a practical standpoint that makes tons of sense.
There certainly have never been any studies done yet to show how long does the coronavirus live on a cleaning cloth that is saturated with a disinfectant. That data doesn't exist, so I'm just extrapolating from what we know about disinfectants and viruses at this point.
Thanks, Linda. Here's one. I'm not sure how much guidance or insight we might have onto this, but I will throw this question out. So within hotels that may have spas or hot tubs or hydrotherapy pools within the healthcare setting, whether it's coronavirus or viruses in general, what's the likelihood of transmission and what special precautions, if any, should be taken?
Well, certainly some. I'll let you start in a second, Ed. But certainly someone who's infectious and actively shedding the virus through their droplets shouldn't be in those kinds of areas.
Yeah. So Ruth, all I was going to say is make sure that high touch point surfaces within the pool and hot tub areas are being disinfected regularly. To prevent surface-to-person transmission. I would say manage your pool and your hot tub in a lodging situation as you do today.
Otherwise, I don't have any recommendations in that setting.
Yeah, there's no evidence that we have of transmission through this route of coronaviruses to date.
Okay. We've had a lot of questions come in regarding specific products and their effectiveness. We won't dive into specific product names, but we have talked a little bit about disinfectants and proper cleaning procedures. Any general guidance beyond what was already discussed during the webinar regarding the types of products you should be looking for surface cleaning?
So from a food service, hospitality, and long-term care standpoint, like I said, contact your, if you use Ecolab, contact your local Ecolab representative. They will be able to give you the guidance on the products that are recommended. Possibly some are already in the portfolio today. If not, they can recommend products that are outside of your portfolio but have emerging pathogen claims on them, specifically for coronavirus.
I would just say for healthcare, obviously contact your Ecolab account executive for specific information about products, but the EPA has developed guidance for manufacturers on how to be able to state effectiveness against novel coronavirus by meeting the criteria for this emerging viral pathogens claim. And so the EPA has detailed guidance on their website, and companies that sell disinfectants then will be able to communicate to you which of their products meet those emerging viral pathogen claims. And so if you talk to your Ecolab associate, they can tell you exactly which products meet those claims.
Okay. A lot of information shared today, so, I guess this is a bit of a recap question. What are the top 2 or 3 action steps that businesses should take to help protect their employees and guests?
Well, I would say, ensuring that employees are aware of the information about coronavirus and sharing, for example, this webinar with your employees could certainly be a way to do that, but there's lots and lots of materials out there, making sure they're from a credible source and reflect the relevant risk that might be presented in your particular area. And then making sure that employees follow the right health and hygiene practices, certainly focused in on hand hygiene, washing their hands thoroughly with soap and water, or using hand sanitizer if soap and water are not available, those alcohol-based hand sanitizers, for example. And then focusing in on isolating themselves if employees are sick, practicing sneeze and cough etiquette, disinfection of high touch point surfaces, et cetera. Again, following the standard sorts of practices that one might follow when there might be an elevated risk related to the influenza viruses and so on.
Great, thank you, Ruth. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and I would like to take a moment to thank our presenters, Dr. Ruth Petran, Linda Holman, Dr. Tatiana Lorca, and Ed Snodgrass. Thank you for your time today and providing your expertise and guidance. Just a reminder to all of our participants that we will send out a copy of the presentation from this webinar, so please watch for that and share that with your teams. And we will have a recording of this webinar posted to ecolab.com very soon. So keep an eye out for that as well and share that link with your teams as needed. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us. We did have some questions about future coronavirus webinars. It is something that we are definitely considering once we have a better understanding of this particular coronavirus or there are new developments that we do need to address. So stay tuned for more information on that as well. We did receive all of these questions. Unfortunately, we did not have time to get to all of them. but we will take a look at how best to recap the questions that have come in and provide guidance as well. So one more thing to keep an eye out for. So again, thank you for your time today. Product-specific questions, please make sure that you're reaching out to your Ecolab representative, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for your time today.